We tend to think of danger as something that arrives with noise, a knock at the door at the wrong hour, a voice on the phone asking questions it shouldn't know to ask. We build our defenses facing outward, watching the street, checking the locks. Nobody tells you to watch the dining room table on Christmas morning. My name is Lorne. I'm 67 years old and I live in Hamilton, Ontario. In the house my wife Beverly and I bought in 1989 when the street still had elm trees on both sides and the neighbors all knew your name before you finished moving in. Beverly died 2 winters ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from the diagnosis to the end, which the doctors said was mercifully fast. I am still not sure who that mercy was meant for. The house is a century home, red brick, 3 bedrooms, a backyard that gets good afternoon sun. It's worth considerably more than we paid for it. Hamilton has changed. The whole corridor from Toronto West has changed, and anyone who owns in the old neighborhoods has watched their property values climb in ways that feel disconnected from any reality you actually lived. I worked 34 years as a licensed pipe fitter, most of it with the same mechanical contractor in Stony Creek. I retired at 62 with a solid pension the house paid off, and enough in my RRSPs to be comfortable without being reckless about it. Beverly was a school secretary for 28 years. We weren't extravagant people. We just kept showing up. My daughter Renata is 38. She lives in Ancaster with her husband Bryce and their 2 girls. Bryce works in commercial lending at one of the downtown branches. He has the kind of ease about him that comes from having always gotten what he wanted, the sort of man who laughs at his own jokes just a half beat before other people do. I never found a reason to dislike him directly. He was always pleasant, always asking the right questions, always helpful in the specific way that doesn't cost him anything. Renata and I got closer after Beverly passed. The way you sometimes do when the person who connected you is suddenly gone, and you have to find the thread yourself. We have lunch every few weeks. She calls on Sunday evenings, same as her mother used to. She worries about me in the house alone, and I let her because it makes her feel useful, and it costs me nothing to answer the phone. Christmas this past year, they came over on the 26th, Boxing Day, which is how we'd always done it even when the girls were small. Bryce came in ahead of Renata, carrying a bag from a tech shop on Locke Street, and wearing the particular expression of a man who's already decided you're going to love what he's brought. Renata was carrying the girls' things and a casserole dish covered in foil. She smiled when she saw me, but it was the slightly tired smile she'd been wearing since October. And I hadn't asked about closely enough. The gift was a home health monitor, one of those systems marketed specifically at older people living alone. A hub unit for the hallway, a wearable wristband that tracked heart rate and sleep, and a small device for the bathroom described in the packaging as a discrete wellness sensor. Bryce had already downloaded the companion app on his own phone. He walked me through it, standing in my front hallway with the efficiency of a man who'd rehearsed the explanation. He said Renata would sleep better. He said it was peace of mind. He said the response time, if anything happened, was under 4 minutes. He said all of this warmly. The way you say things you want people to remember hearing. He had the hub plugged in and registered inside of 30 minutes. He set up the wristband on my wrist himself, clasped it like it was nothing, told me I'd get used to it. He left with Renata and the girls after dinner. I stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed, looking at the small blue light on the hub, and felt something I couldn't name yet. Something that sat in the chest the way a word does when it's on the tip of your tongue. I wore the wristband for 3 weeks. I told myself I'd gotten used to it. I hadn't. The person who changed things was my old friend Cormac. We've known each other since our apprenticeship days, both of us coming up through the trades in the mid-'80s when Hamilton still had real industry running along the waterfront. Cormac spent the last 15 years of his career in building systems and infrastructure security before retiring and teaching part-time at Mohawk College. He knows how things connect. He knows what signals are moving through a building, even when you can't see them. We meet for coffee most Thursdays at a place on James Street North that does good dark roast and has the decency to leave you alone. I mentioned the health monitor, not in a worried way, just in conversation, the way you mention things when you're not sure what you think of them yet. I showed him the wristband, described the hub, told him Bryce had administrator access on his phone, that he'd set the whole system up himself. Cormac set his cup down carefully and asked me the name of the system. He typed it into his phone. He didn't say anything for what felt like longer than it was. Then he asked if Bryce had kept admin access after setup. I said I assumed so. He'd never mentioned removing it. Cormac said he needed to see the hub. That Thursday afternoon in my hallway, Cormac looked at the hub the way a man looks at something when he already suspects what he's going to find. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He connected his phone to my Wi-Fi and ran something I didn't fully understand, a network scan of some kind, and watched what came back. He said, "This device is sending data to 3 separate endpoints." I said I didn't know what that meant. He said, "It means the data leaving your house isn't just going to the app you can see. There are 2 additional destinations. One of them is registered to a corporate account. I can't tell you whose without more digging, but I can tell you it's not the manufacturer." I sat down on the second stair. He said, "The bathroom sensor is the one that concerns me most. It's classified as a wellness device, but the audio pickup on this model is significantly wider than what it needs to be for fall detection." He paused. He had the careful manner of someone who has spent years delivering technical information to people who don't want to hear it. He said, "Someone with admin access to this system can hear conversations in your home." I didn't say anything. He said, "I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying that's what this allows." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said the thing that had been sitting in the back of my mind since December 26th, since Bryce clasped that wristband on my wrist like it was nothing. I said, "Bryce set it all up himself." Cormac looked at me with the expression of a man who isn't surprised but wishes he were. That evening I drove home along the escarpment road with the hub in a reusable bag on the passenger seat. Hamilton spread out below me the way it always does at that hour, the bay going gray-blue in the fading light. The old smokestacks still visible against the sky even after everything around them changed. I've driven that road so many times I don't see it anymore. I saw it that night. I didn't call Renata. I didn't call anyone. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table and thought about Bryce standing in my hallway on Boxing Day, clicking that wristband into place and calling it peace of mind. The next morning I went to the Halton-Hamilton RCMP detachment on Upper James. The officer at the front desk was polite and took me seriously, which I hadn't entirely expected. I asked for a detective. The one I eventually sat across from was a woman named Detective Yarrow, probably early 50s, short hair, the composed manner of someone who has heard enough to stop being surprised. She listened without interrupting. She took the hub. She took the photos. Cormac had sent me of the network scan on his phone. She said she'd be in touch. On the drive home, I passed the arena where Renata played hockey every Saturday morning for 6 years. The building is the same. The parking lot has new lines. I thought about Bryce in my hallway. 30 minutes. Efficient, cheerful. Peace of mind, he'd said. The call from Detective Yarrow came 5 days later. She said the technical review had confirmed the system was transmitting to a secondary account. She said the account was registered to an email address associated with a numbered company Bryce had incorporated 2 years earlier. She said the audio pickup in the bathroom device had been intentionally extended beyond factory specification before it arrived in my home. She asked me if I was aware of any legal or financial matters involving my estate, whether anyone had raised the topic of future planning or power of attorney recently. I said not directly, but even as I said it, I was thinking about a conversation at Thanksgiving. Bryce mentioning, Over dishes, how complicated estate situations get when there's no clear documentation in place. How he'd seen it at work, families left sorting things out without the right instruments, properties going through probate for years. He'd said it in that informational tone he uses, the one that sounds like he's sharing useful knowledge. I'd thought it was just conversation. Detective Yarrow told me not to remove the device, not to change my behavior, to act as though I didn't know. She said those words exactly. I went home and stood in the hallway looking at the hub with its small blue light, and I said out loud to no one I should call Cormac tomorrow. Then I went to bed. 3 days later, my son-in-law texted me asking if I'd noticed any disruption to the system. He'd seen an alert that the hub had been briefly offline. I said I must have bumped it. My voice was steady when I read the words back before sending. That took more than it should have. The folder was in the drawer of the writing desk in the spare room. The one Renata uses when she comes with the girls and needs to do work on her laptop. I'd gone in looking for a USB cable and found it under a thin cardigan she'd left folded in the drawer. Manila folder. My name on the tab in Bryce's handwriting. I stood there holding it for what felt like a long time before I opened it. Inside were printed documents. Legal in their formatting, the particular font that announces itself as serious before you read a single word. The language took me a moment to fully register because I wasn't expecting it. Power of attorney template. Financial. Capacity assessment form, Ontario Standard. Application for guardianship of property. And underneath those, on 3 pages of ruled notepaper in Bryce's handwriting, a list of observations. Dated, some going back 8 months. November 14 mentioned tweets in conversation as if current. Seemed confused when corrected. January 7, took wrong exit off QEW, had to be redirected. Possible disorientation. February 3, couldn't recall whether he'd taken blood pressure medication. Asked twice. B was Beverly, my wife. Dead 2 winters now. I had mentioned her in conversation the way you mention someone who was your life for 38 years. Her name comes up because she is woven into nearly everything I have done or thought or remembered since 1986. I wasn't confused, I was grieving. And Bryce had smoothed the difference flat with a ballpoint pen and a date, the wrong exit off the QEW. I remembered that day. We'd been talking, he and I, about something I no longer recall, and I'd missed the exit because I was paying attention to the conversation rather than the road. I was 67 years old and tired from a week that had included a plumbing issue and a difficult night's sleep. I'd laughed about it and turned around at the next interchange. He had written it down. The last page was a property assessment. My house on Sherman, dated 4 months ago. Market value $748,000. Below it, in Bryce's handwriting, my pension monthly amount, the approximate balance of my RRSPs, my life insurance policy number and issuer. I had not authorized any assessment of my property. I closed the folder. I put it back exactly where I found it. I went to the kitchen and ran cold water over my wrists at the sink, which is what I've done to calm myself since I was a young man working in tight spaces in the summer heat. Then I called Cormac. He listened without speaking. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked me one question. He said, "Has Bryce ever talked to you directly about the house? About what happens to it?" I thought about it. Not directly. There had been the Thanksgiving conversation. There had been a comment last summer about the neighborhood, how Renata had grown up here and what it would mean to keep it in the family. At the time, I'd heard it as sentiment. Now I heard it differently. Cormac said, "You need a lawyer before you need anything else, and you need to keep behaving as though that camera is your friend." That was the hardest to understand from the inside. Walking through my own home as if I were performing for an audience I couldn't see. Speaking out loud to no one about forgetting things. I said once, standing in the hallway, that managing everything alone was starting to feel like more than I could keep track of. I said it carefully, not recklessly, enough to suggest what they were looking for. Then I wrote down what I'd said, the time, the exact words, and brought it to Cormac that afternoon. He showed me how to keep a secure log, handwritten with dates and times, photographed and stored in 2 separate locations. He said, "Courts in Ontario still weigh handwritten records. People your age get dismissed. Paper keeps you in the room." The responses came the way I expected. My son-in-law texted to check in. My daughter called more often, the worry in her voice real even if the source of it had been engineered. He brought groceries one afternoon unannounced, stood in my kitchen asking about my pills, asking in that careful, measured way whether I'd thought about the future, whether having support managing things might take some pressure off. I said things were fine. I let just the edge of uncertainty cross my face. Not much. Enough. My lawyer, Ken Ibarra, has an office on King Street East. He handled Beverly's estate and has known me since before she died. I called him the morning after Cormac told me I needed to. I brought the folder. He read every page at his desk with his glasses on, and the expression of a man who is working to stay professional about something that has made him angry. He said, "This is a guardianship of property play. Whoever drafted these templates knows the Ontario process well enough to have built a credible starting point." He told me the same thing Detective Yarrow had told me. Document everything. Change nothing outwardly. Sign nothing. I went home and put the folder back. Over the following 2 weeks, I did something that cost me a particular kind of dignity every time I did it. I gave them material, measured, careful, nothing that couldn't be walked back. I said out loud in the hallway that I'd nearly forgotten my GP appointment last Tuesday. I mentioned once in the kitchen that I wasn't sure whether I'd renewed my prescriptions. I said, one afternoon in the living room, that it was getting harder to stay on top of things. Each time I went to Cormac's afterward and wrote it down. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday. My son-in-law said it would just be the 4 of us, without the girls. He said it was time they talked about some things together as a family. His tone was the warmest it had been in months. Sunday dinner was at their place in Ancaster. The girls were in bed by the time the coffee came out. He sat forward in the way men sit when they've prepared what they're about to say. He talked about how much they loved me, about how hard the last 2 years had been for all of them, about how Beverly would have wanted them to make sure I was taken care of. He paused when he said her name. Then he slid a folder across the table, different from the one in the spare room drawer, cleaner, more finished. My name at the top. His name listed as attorney for property. He said it was just a starting point, just a way to make things simpler. He said the word simpler 3 times. I looked at Renata. She was looking at the table, not at me. I picked up the folder. I turned the pages slowly. I said I would need some time to go through it carefully. He said, of course, take all the time I needed, and he was relaxed when he said it. He thought the outcome was already settled. I called Detective Yarrow that night and told her about the folder. She said, "That's what we needed." The following Thursday I called him, calm, no drama. I asked him one question. I asked whether he still had admin access to the health monitoring system he'd set up in my home. He said yes. To make sure it was working properly, I asked whether he'd been checking the audio. The pause that followed was only a few seconds, but I'd worked in mechanical systems for 34 years. I know what a pressure drop sounds like, even when it's small. He said he didn't know what I was suggesting. His voice had tightened in the specific way that voices do when someone is controlling them rather than just speaking. I said I wasn't suggesting anything. I said good night. I sat in the kitchen afterward with the lights off and understood that I had moved too soon. Cormac had told me. The detective had told me. The impatience of knowing the truth before you're permitted to use it, that's where people lose everything they've spent years protecting. I sat with that for a long time. 4 days of silence followed. No texts, no calls from Renata. The quiet had a texture to it. Then an email arrived. Subject, thinking about you, Dad. He addressed me as Dad in emails the way he always had, and I had never minded until now. He wrote that he and Renata had been talking. that they wanted to sit down with me and a financial advisor he respected, someone who specialized in retirement planning and estate organization for people in my situation. He wrote that they didn't want to pressure me, but that Renata had been losing sleep. He wrote that Beverly would have wanted them to make sure everything was in order. He used her name again, in an email. As leverage, I forwarded it to Ken. I forwarded it to Detective Yarrow. Ken said, "That's enough." The meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday at Ken's office on King Street. It was presented to them as a routine estate planning conversation. Ken was careful with the language. My son-in-law arrived in a sport coat with his leather folder under his arm and the confidence of a man who has already counted the money. I want to tell you what it was like to walk into that room knowing what was coming. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I'd expected the anger to show itself, in the jaw, in the shoulders, the way it does when you've been holding something in for longer than is comfortable. But I walked into that boardroom at 10 in the morning and I felt the way I used to feel on a complex job when the planning was done, and the only thing left was the work itself. Ken's boardroom has a long table, high windows, a view down toward the escarpment. Renata came in first. She hugged me and didn't quite meet my eyes. My son-in-law came in second, sat across from me, looked at me with certainty. He thought he knew how this was going to end. Detective Yarrow was already in the room. She introduced herself to both of them. My son-in-law's hand tightened on the leather folder. Ken opened with a brief summary. Then he placed a document on the table and said the home health monitoring system installed in my home in December had been reviewed by a licensed communications specialist and by the RCMP's technical unit. He said the system had been configured to transmit audio to a secondary account registered to a numbered company incorporated by my son-in-law 2 years prior. My son-in-law said that was incorrect. Ken placed a second document on the table. Independent Technical Assessment. RCMP confirmation. Renata looked at her husband. Ken said, "We also have the folder." He meant the one from the spare room drawer. Photocopied pages in a neat stack. The handwritten notes on ruled paper. November 14. B mentioned as if current. Wrong exit. QEW. Beverly's name at the top of a list built to make me look like I was losing my mind. My son-in-law said the notes were legitimate concern, that he had been watching me decline for 2 years, that I was a proud man who couldn't ask for help. Detective Yarrow leaned forward. She said, "You were building a record to support a guardianship of property application you had already had drafted. We've spoken to the paralegal involved." He held his composure for longer than I expected. He used words like concern and love and protecting Renata's future. His voice stayed even. But Renata was not looking at him. Renata said his name, just his name. Quietly, the way you say something when you've already decided. Ken said, "There's an email." I won't repeat the line directly. The email to the estate planning paralegal said that establishing diminished capacity quickly would simplify the transfer of property and registered assets before any complicating factors arose. The room held that for a moment. Renata put her hand over her mouth. My son-in-law stood up. That I had manipulated the setup. That I had manipulated the situation. That everything he'd done came from a place of genuine worry. He said Beverly would have wanted Renata to be protected. I looked at him when he said that. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him until he stopped. Then I said, "Beverly worked beside me for 38 years to build what we have. She would have wanted it to go where she and I put it, not where you put it." He sat back down. Detective Yarrow told him they would be in contact regarding the unauthorized audio collection and the misrepresentations made during the property assessment inquiry. She said it without satisfaction. She was just clear. There was no dramatic arrest. He left with Renata, who looked like she'd been hit from a direction she hadn't expected. Which I suppose she had. I stayed behind with Ken for a few minutes. He asked if I was all right. I said I was. He said he'd be in touch about next steps. When I walked out onto King Street, the March air hit me the way Hamilton air does in early spring. Cold still, but with something different underneath it, the particular smell of a city remembering it has seasons. I stood by for my truck for a moment and looked at the street. The same buildings I'd walked past since I was an apprentice carrying tools I could barely afford. I thought about Bryce clasping that wristband onto my wrist on Boxing Day, cheerful, efficient, calling it peace of mind. I said out loud, to no one, "You should have just given me a gift card from Canadian Tire." Then I drove home. Renata called 4 days later. She cried the way people cry when the crying has been happening in private for a while and finally has somewhere to go. She said she hadn't known about the folder in the spare room, hadn't known about the property assessment or the paralegal. She said he had told her only that he was worried about me, that he was documenting things in case they ever needed to get me help. She said, "Dad, I was so scared of losing you the way we lost Mom." He knew exactly what to say to me. I believed her. I still do, but belief doesn't repair things immediately. It just gives you a place to begin. We're still finding our way back to what we were. Some things take time you can't schedule. Within 2 weeks of that meeting, I changed every password I had, reviewed every account, met with Ken to update my will and power of attorney, assigning a trusted friend as financial attorney rather than family directly connected to Bryce. I set up a formal trustee arrangement that would require multiple parties to act in concert. Ken called it belt and suspenders planning. I called it what it was, protecting what Beverly and I spent our lives building. I learned something in all of this that I didn't know how to put into words until Cormac said it for me. He came over for dinner one evening after things had settled. We ate at the dining room table, which felt right. He said, "You know what the worst part of this is? You had to pretend to be less than you are, just to prove that you are what you are." I've thought about that a lot since. There is a cost to wearing a costume of your own worst fears. It doesn't leave a mark anyone can see, but you feel it in the quiet moments. I still sometimes walk past the spare room and think about standing there, holding that folder. The way a relationship you thought you understood can become unrecognizable in the time it takes to read one page of handwriting. The hub is gone. The wristband is gone. I know that sounds extreme to some people, but I spent 34 years understanding systems and how they fail, and I've earned the right to decide what runs in my own house. I have good locks and Cormac's phone number, and the knowledge that I've protected what matters. That's enough. Here is what I want to leave with you, because after everything I've just told you, I think you deserve the plain version. At 67, I thought the years of real danger had passed. I thought what remained was maintenance. Staying healthy, staying connected, keeping the house from falling apart at the eaves. What I learned is that the dangerous years don't end. They change shape. They show up in your hallway wearing a sport coat, carrying a gift, calling it love. The people who want what you've spent your life building don't always come at you from outside. Sometimes they come through the door you've already opened for them. Sometimes they come as Boxing Day gifts. Sometimes they come as worry. If someone in your life is paying close attention to your routines, your finances, your health, your memory, not the way people who love you pay attention, but the way someone gathering evidence pays attention, trust that feeling. Write it down. Talk to a lawyer before you talk to them. And if someone offers to help you manage things, take whatever time you need before you hand over anything at all. Your home, your savings, your name, your right to make your own decisions. Those things are worth protecting carefully and without apology. Don't let anyone tell you that protecting them is the same as not trusting the people who love you. Real love doesn't need administrator access to your life. If this story felt familiar in some way, don't keep it to yourself. These things survive in silence. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you're watching from Voices of Uncle Gerald, you know this is exactly the kind of story I think needs to be told. Stay aware, stay steady, take care of yourselves out there.